The cousins that I grew up spending the most amount of my time with was the kids of my mom's sister. So my mom and her sister are about 3 years apart and have been close most of their life. I am the oldest cousin in this group of cousins, and then my sister and my cousin Amanda were born 3 weeks apart. There's even another cousin who was born another 3 weeks apart. So there's 3 of them in 6 weeks. So they were all really close and spent lots of time with each other, and I was the older cousin for many years, sort of set apart from them. But when I turned 10, my Aunt Dawn had a baby, which excited me greatly because I was going to have a baby to play with, because I couldn't play with the 7-year-old cousins, obviously. So I was going to finally have a baby to play with. I was so excited. But when Matthew was born, he hated everyone but his parents, which was a huge bummer for me. But there was this one time, seemingly miraculous moment when Matthew just let my mom hold him to her chest for like hours, which was very out of character for this baby. We're sitting in the living room, everyone is talking, and finally, from across the room, my aunt, Matthew's mom, laughs. And when she laughs, Matthew pushes my mom away and starts crying and reaches for his mom. My mom and my aunt have such similar voices that my cousin Matthew thought that he was laying on his mom's chest. But they have just slightly distinct laughs that he could recognize his mom was across the room. Right? This infant doesn't recognize his mom necessarily by her face or by any sort of identification factors we might look at people and know who they are. Instead, for Matthew, it was the sound of his mother's voice, and maybe even more distinctly, the sound of her laugh. In this story with Thomas needing to touch the wounds of Jesus, I see the same thing happening. He trusts, but needs to verify that this is the right person. I don't really see him doubting, but sort of being incredulous, right? How could this be? I need to verify this is true, right, before I put my whole faith in it. And the way that Thomas will know that this person is his rabbi, his teacher, his papa, is not by the sound of his voice, but by his wounds, touching his wounds. You might remember on Easter, we tell the story of Mary Magdalene discovering Jesus in the garden. And Mary Magdalene recognized Jesus, came to see Jesus for who he was by his voice. Right? Not by seeing his face, not by anything other than his voice calling her name. It was so familiar to her, she could confirm this is Jesus. But Thomas knows Jesus by his wounds. Maybe looking back on Jesus' ministry, right, looking at all of it with hindsight. The thing for Thomas that sets Jesus apart is his wounds. He doesn't want to check his passport, right, or run any facial recognition. He wants to see his scars. Even more than this, the name Thomas means twin. And so it makes me wonder, perhaps he was a twin and knows maybe how easy it is to trick people into mistaking your identity. The twins I know like to pull those kinds of shenanigans. So Thomas needs to know, to confirm that this is Jesus the Christ. We don't know a lot about the wounds that Jesus carried with him throughout his ministry, right? We know about his wounds post-crucifixion. There is so much written about Jesus' wounds. If you want to get into it, you can. There's lots to read. But we don't know a lot about his woundedness before his crucifixion. But none of us can escape wounds. Perhaps Jesus' wounds were related to the burden of being the Messiah, of having that knowledge about himself. Or maybe it was related to knowing that his life would be short and that he would die violently. Maybe he didn't marry or have children because of that. Maybe that was a wound. We don't know particularly what his wounds are. We can imagine, but we don't know for sure. But this story, with Thomas needing to touch his wounds to confirm it's him, seems to tell us that Jesus always had them. Jesus had always had wounds, and that Thomas was so familiar with them that they were the thing, like my aunt's laugh, that was so particular to him, he would be able to verify his identity. It makes me wonder that maybe Thomas was one of those people, one of the disciples who was closest to Jesus, kind of and resonated with mostly in Jesus' healing ministries, right? When we hear stories of healing in the Gospels, it makes me want to go back and read those healing stories and imagine Thomas there. Right? It seems that Thomas's primary formation with Jesus is about woundedness and healing. We do know that Thomas was with Jesus at the raising of Lazarus, right? One of the only times that Jesus weeps in the Bible is at the death of Lazarus, and then he raises him up. Henry Nouwen wrote a book called Wounded Healer, which is sort of one of our inspiration for today's theme. And there's a society about Henry Nouwen's work. There's a lot written about being a wounded healer, but here's a quote from that society. "Nobody escapes being wounded. We are all wounded people, whether physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually. The main question is not how can we hide our wounds so we don't have to be embarrassed, but instead the question is how can we put our woundedness in service of others? When our wounds cease to be a source of shame and instead become a source of healing, we have become wounded healers. Jesus is God's wounded healer. Through his wounds, we are healed. Jesus' suffering and death brought joy and life. As followers of Jesus, we can also allow our wounds to bring healing to others. Healing begets healing. Being perfect does not beget healing. When we experience healing ourselves, we can then offer the source of our own healing, the love and the comfort and the meaning-making that we receive from God to others, for it to heal them too. One of the pieces of wisdom that we receive as pastors being formed into ministry, one of those pieces of advice is preach from your scars, not your wounds. It's an important piece of information to stand up here and not to bleed all over you, but to preach from a place of a healed wound. And I think that's mostly right. But only if we never, ever forget what being wounded is like. Our woundedness offers people a sense of solidarity, right? Sharing our wounds with people. It offers people a sense of solidarity, right, and companionship, that we can walk alongside them in their own woundedness, which is good and has its purpose. And we offer people healing when we let people stick their hands in our sides and in our hands, feeling around to get a sense of the injuries we've sustained, and letting people into that woundedness so that they can actually feel the healed places too. We offer people healing from our scars, from the places that have begun to heal. Knowing that other people's wounds have started to heal is a message of hope that our wounds that are freshly opened will one day heal in some way too. And the good news is that you don't have to be fully healed to start, right? This is coming days after Jesus' crucifixion. The wounds in his hands and in his side are still open enough that Thomas can stick his hands into them. They've just begun to heal. but Thomas can already feel around for places that have begun to heal. And perhaps this knowing that Jesus, his rabbi, is so wounded gives him a sense that his wounds get to be present in the space too, get to be known by his community, and he gets to feel around for that sense of hope that one day his will heal too. Waiting for everything to be resolved in our lives before we start offering what has saved us to other people, if we wait for that, we won't ever offer it. We won't ever become healers if we wait for every wound to be fully healed. One of the wounds of my life, you all know this, but my parents got divorced when I was in high school, and it just felt like the death of my family. It felt like a big death. That's how I experienced it. And one of the things that I have come to learn as I've grown up, each time my life changes, it reopens in this new way, right? It has to heal all over again. You have to open it up again and re-heal it. It's going to be a wound that I live with perpetually. And yet it can heal, and it does heal, and it has healed. And I know that it will be injured once again. If I wait until it is fully healed and it doesn't bother me anymore, it doesn't itch, I don't even remember it, then I will never, ever be able to be a presence of hope for other people who are wounded in the same way. Henry Nouwen's legacy group, they end that quote by saying, "As followers of Jesus, we can also bring our wounds to bring healing to others." And so I invite you into a time of reflection, inviting you to think about looking with hindsight on the own wounds that you have experienced in your own life, the wounds you carry now, and ask yourself, how might they bring healing to other people? How can you use your wounds, your healed wounds, your healing wounds in service of others? So have a few minutes for quiet reflection.